the deadline of disclosure for this book, ultimately. And as I was looking through doing initial research, I started discovering the pictures. I did not know that there were photographs of the fire. I had not known. I didn't know how many of them there were, but I was astonished by what I was just even seeing, again, via Google and poking around the Central Washington University Library site and the Fred Krueger collection and so forth. And the photos were amazing, and I had known about Arcadia Press because I tend to buy their books because they're basically picture books, you know? And they have a form on their website that says if you have an idea, contact us. And I did, expecting to hear nothing. And I heard within like 48 hours, yeah, we'd be interested in doing this. And then I kind of all of a sudden was committed to do it. And then the horse race was on, and how to do it, how to go about doing that without even knowing how many photos there actually were. And they need 125. But one thing that I came to early with it in terms of how to structure it was knowing that there might be somebody who's like obsessed with fires somewhere in Ohio who would want to read about a little town in the West that burned and came back from it. And so I needed to provide context. So it's separate into before the fire, during the fire, and then after the fire, just to have that context. So I spent the very smoky summer of 2017 over here, mostly, digging around, hanging out with Fred Krueger, who is just a kind of a god, and it was also was that Jolly Mountain Fire?
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt like I was surrounded by fire that summer, you know, really, metaphorically and actually, and I know nothing about photography really, you know, other than point the cell phone, and I needed technical help, so I dragged my son in. My son is not here with me tonight. He was the first time I presented here 4 years ago at the centenary, I've never known the difference, of the fire, but and that's him there, and he was my technical guy. He was Mr. Computer when I wanted to throw it out the window, and he is a crack editor. In fact, professionally, he is a proofreader and editor by trade. So I grabbed him in, and it wouldn't have happened really without him stepping in at key moments to keep me from tearing my hair out. So that was kind of how the whole thing came about, kind of to my surprise, actually. So what did I discover? I'm going to start with this slide here. So talking about what Cle Elum was, and at the, let's see, no, that isn't there. There we go. It was not a company town. It was established when two people who had fought together, both had fought in the Civil War, came west and ran into each other in Yakima, and came up here and started poking around and discovered coal, as we know, and they platted the town. The first plat was in 1886, and because they had preemption land ability, they were called preemption homesteading, where you had to normally prove that you could produce on the land that you homesteaded over a 5-year period, but on preemption claims, you could do it. You could subtract from those 5 years the amount of time that you'd served in the Army during the war. So they were able to shave a little bit of time off that and make things proceed more quickly, and so it actually came into being more quickly than it would have otherwise. So Walter Reed, no relation to Walter Reed Army Hospital, was the first one. He was actually on site in Roslyn when they discovered coal, and then the seams here as well in Cle Elum. And he platted basically most of what we call the downtown core, and it is referred to as OT, the original town plat, and then there was a first edition. Then Thomas Gamble platted the Hazelwood edition to the east of town, and there was a second edition to that as well. We know that it was a coal mining town, a railroad town, and a lumber town, right, obviously. How many of you have relatives who were miners here in this room? Yeah. right? Yeah, and it was a very big deal. Railroad people? Anybody? Railroad? Yep. Okay. Or both? Yeah. Right, and that fueled it. But it was not a company town in the sense that Roslyn was. The miners in Cle Elum were not, their wages were not paid basically to the company store, and then everything came out of that. You know, it was not that sort of thing. Though the Northwest Improvement Company clearly had a strong presence, and it was not exclusively for the miners either. So it wasn't fully a company town. But labor was important. The organizing of the miners in Roslyn provoked in 1917 the Pinkertons to come to town, in fact, because there was a lot of organizing going on, and a bunch of miners out of Roslyn or those who were in organizing positions or actively involved in that were arrested and taken to Seattle, including my grandfather, who was not a miner. He was a barber, as I said, but he was still involved, and he was very much in favor of the labor movement, and he was picked up too, and he was released in a week because he was already a U.S. citizen. Not all were, and I don't know the details of that. That's my next project. But this photo sort of expresses some of that. But another reason for my having included that is that it shows the point quite clearly where the fire broke out in June of 1918, which would have been right about there. Okay, so we're looking down Penn towards the Sound Rocks to the north, and that is where ultimately the fire broke out. So that when we come, let me see. I think I have a slide in here with the numbers. One thing that I did when trying to sort of illustrate what Cle Elum was before the fire, during and after actually, was I went through the census of 1910, because that was the high point of population for Cle Elum, was actually 1910. There were 2,800 people at that point. So I don't know what it is today. I have not looked at the 2020 numbers.
It's about 2,080.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But still not as high as it was in 1910. Go figure, yeah. And I went through, and there are two districts in the census gathering from 1910. I went through one of them, which covered the east end of town, and up to roughly Pio, I would guess. And I counted, and I very scientifically with hash marks in a notebook, how many U.S. citizens there were born in the United States, how many people had been born elsewhere, and how many children of immigrant families there were, and it was stunning. This was such a diverse town and so culturally rich, but that's who we're talking about here. And also, when it came to the labor movement, that was important as well. The east end and the west end of town prior to the fire were very different. Cle Elum got telephone, electricity, and interior or indoor plumbing really early, unexpectedly early. By 1918, there were all of those things on the west end of town. Okay, the east end of town, no. There was no running water. There were no sewers. There was maybe power. I'm not sure about that, but it was a much different town, and that was also where most of the miners lived. The immigrant core as well was East End, so below the Independent, and a very, very different kind of a setting, which will become important. One thing that the founders did, particularly the wife of Walter Reed, in planning it, was to have very wide streets. If you haven't noticed, we've got really super wide streets here that are kind of strange. That's because she had a dream that Cle Elum would become the next Pittsburgh. Not New York, not any other, Pittsburgh. So she insisted on her,
Because of the coal.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I figured, yeah. And so she insisted on triple wide streets, which ended up basically playing a large role in saving the town during the fire. They were wider, less room, it was less apt for the fire to be able to jump across the street. So, yeah. So, we get to the beginning of the fire. Let's see what's up next here. There we go. So I included this to illustrate what the east end of town looked like. Probably, again, shot from the Independent, likely, or one of the mines. And that gives a census tally. 728 adults were born in European countries, 315 adults born in the United States, 269 children born to 2 immigrant parents from just that one ward of the census of 1910. Yeah. So we come to June 25th of 1918. What happened? Nobody knows, actually. They don't know. What we do know, and I'll go on to the next slide, that's one of the very early images of it. We know that the wind was doing what the wind does here. It was blowing. It was 1:30 in the afternoon, and the wind was blowing hard out of the west as it did yesterday, right? And there was the Rose Theater in about the location that the Vogue is today, and then next to it was the Moss Building, and that was a confectionery, and there were rooms let on the second floor, and in between the two there was an airspace. Something happened in that little short kind of semi-perpendicular alley between and back of currently the Eagles up towards First. It runs perpendicular, runs north-south. And in that alley, which existed at that time as well, there was trash accumulated in between the theater and the Moss Building. We think Fred Krueger's theory is that there were stairs that led up to the rooms in the Moss Building, but I haven't seen any photos. I can't confirm that, but that was his theory. And somehow or other, it got lit. How that happened? I mean, everybody always goes, "Oh, it was a stray match." What are the? I don't know. You know, what are the odds of somebody walking by there and just, "Oh, I'll just throw a match over there underneath those wooden steps and all that trash"? You'd do that, or right? That's another theory. And also because it was a confectionery, there was a lot of cooking going on, and who knows? A spark might have come out the chimney from the coal stove, or something burned there, and something happened, and that was what it was. It was that simple, but we don't know exactly what that was. And so it started, and Mona Moss saw it, and she was the first to call. She had a telephone, and she called the fire department, which was in the same location as it is today, and that was City Hall for a while too. And at that point, it was said that you could have put the blaze out with a garden hose. But that didn't last long, because that 1.5 foot airspace, so roughly that wide, acted like a chimney, and it pulled everything straight up and headed it to the east. Okay, and before anybody knew it, things were just in flames, and there was almost nothing that could be done. The first hose that was deployed by the fire department melted on the ground before it could actually spray any water. It was that hot, that fast, that furious. They couldn't do a thing about it. One of my little tidbits that I learned was that Costello and Duffy's Men's Clothiers had received an entire shipment of men's furnishings, clothing and stuff, and the fire broke out, and they managed to pick up all the display cases and pull them across the street to the south side of the street at first. And they were fine. They didn't lose their stock because the fire never jumped first there. Okay, it just started heading to the east and heading there hard. It went down basically up to where the state bank was, now the Umpqua Bank. That was spared in part because Bat Masterson, 4 miles to the whatever direction that is, got on his horse, saw the smoke that was billowing, rode into town, and he and John Koshevnikov and Frank Carpenter of this very building managed to, well, first of all they got on the roof and they emptied the rain barrel and soaked down the roof. And Bat Masterson apparently was pulling out the flaming window sashes, the wooden sashes. And so it didn't catch there. It skipped the steam laundry. There was a steam laundry directly to the north of what was in business for ages. And it skipped that because it hadn't caught at that point, but it was heading towards the school. And that's not the school that we know today. That school was 1922 built. It was a big old frame. It could have gone up like tinder. clapboard wooden building, and that also the head custodian and the president of the senior class, named Harold Cox, got up on the roof and with garden hoses and started spraying it down.
In the same location.
Same location.
Same location, yes. Yeah, and that stopped the fire from going further to 3rd, and the school survived. Now, there were some storage spaces, storage sheds for textbooks, etc., that were burned, but the school itself survived. It's kind of odd how well, not really, because they had garden hoses, and that did help. That did stop it, but it kept on going east. It kept on going east down 2nd, particularly along and 3rd. At one point, some folks from the notion. Some of the things the carts that we had for fire engines were not mechanical. They weren't internal combustion engines. They were horse-drawn, or they were people-drawn. They were carts, not cars, not engines. Okay, and so they were. The fire department was trying to get whoever had a car and didn't need it, to get their stuff out or whatever at that point, was enlisted to go through town dragging hoses because it was faster than the actual carts that they had, because there were hydrants, and so people were put to work there. They had the scheme to, and it was the fire department's idea, to go up to the mines, get black powder, and blow up a bunch of houses in the East End to make a fire break. And 12 of them were actually exploded. They went door to door, asked permission before they did that, and 12 households said, yeah, sure, if that's what it takes, go ahead and do it. One household did not, on 3rd, way the heck down, maybe Floral, on the north side of the street, and they asked permission to explode the building, and the homeowner came out with a shotgun in his hand and said, absolutely not. And as it was, the house didn't burn. So, yay. So it headed down that way. In fighting the fire, the Roslyn Fire Department was on site, as soon as possible and quickly. And in Ellensburg, the fire department there commandeered a train car and came up, and they fought it mostly on the East End, and to support. So there was a lot of support from neighboring communities to help actually fight the fire. At First and Penn, roughly 2 buildings survived. And okay, so one thing that I can tell you is that I wasn't there, so all I can go by is the information that was published or that was written on photos and stuff. There's confusion because what is actually the Kinney building is now where Hawks is. It's on the south side of the street. In the paper, the Cle Elum Echo, the Auto Rest building is called the Kinney building. So I really don't know how that dissonance arose, but the Auto Rest building did survive. The National Bank, the old National Bank building on the corner of First and Penn on the northeast corner survived enough to be reused. Nothing else did. That was it. Full stop. As you head down into town, further to the east, all along 2nd, the only thing that kind of sort of did was the Masonic Lodge. It's some actual walls were there, and there were a few walls here and there, but with the lodge they actually reclaimed the bricks, and the current lodge is built of reclaimed material from post-fire. So I don't know if you want to say it survived or kind of did or limped along or what, but yeah, but that was about it for that. And again, we have images of all of this, and again, you can even see on the cover, I mean, there's so many. I mean, I have my own favorites, but I don't know if you can see from here, I didn't include this. There's the Masonic Lodge after. Yeah. And of course, they were terrified that somebody was going to go, kids would go and play around it, or somebody would go boop, and the whole thing would fall over. So they tried really hard to stabilize where they could, shore things up if they could, and demolish as quickly as possible. But in the immediate aftermath, you can see these single walls just sort of barely standing there with nothing holding them up. And this map shows what all was affected. And I think when we think about what Cle Elum is, and you kind of go, well, that's not very much. Yeah, it is. It is. So first in pen there. So nothing to the west was burned. And then we hit the east. Okay, and again, going back to that picture of the East End with the miners' cottages, it wasn't just the cottages. A lot of those cottages not only had the family living there, but they had boarders in what we would today call tiny houses, right? And they had another family there, or two brothers from Poland, or a family of mom, dad, and 3 kids, related, not related. They rented out. Those little lots were packed. It was not just one structure per lot, if you will. It was often much more than that. Okay, so yeah, again, the photos are just remarkably evocative of. If I can find this one quickly. Again, like I said, I have my favorites, but.
Do you know where those houses, about where they were that were blown up in the effort to further move on? Right there.
Yeah.
How many people died?
0. Yeah, I was coming to that. Yeah, nobody died, which is amazing because there had been an explosion at I don't know which mine it was. Actually, I've never read which one it was, where there was a powder explosion at the mine, and apparently I read some really grisly details of body parts being flung over a quarter, half a mile, and 9 people were killed and many injured. There were a few injuries in this fire that had to do with somebody got hit by a truck going down Second. Somebody there was an injury from breaking glass, because the glass on the south side of First Street in the storefronts, those did crack. Some shattered from the heat. And so there were, 2 or 3 things, but people were hospitalized, but for observation, not for any terrible wounds or damage, or injury, which I think is kind of amazing. And there's a story, and this is if I can find it. Well, basically, in this series there's a series of several photos that I kept emailing Fred Krueger saying, "Hey, Fred, can we figure out where this is? Do we know where this is?" And like, no. Fred, this is the last time you're going to hear from me. What do you think, first or second? And he was so patient with me, bless him. But in this one, there's a picture. I don't know if you can tell there. There's a high chair. And there's a photo or a story about a little tyke in a baby carriage who was taken. They put valuables when they pulled him out of the house, and this is more appropriate to this area where the streets were wider, but wherever they could, the valuables would go into the middle of the street, because that was the safest place, because it was hitting the structures and jumping, but maybe it wouldn't. So there's a little tyke parked in a baby carriage in the middle of the street, and the parent looked down, and a spark had hit the coverlet, covering the baby, so that baby was scooted to safety clearly and was fine. But it's really hard for us to imagine what that must have looked like. But it was a huge, huge plume of smoke as it headed east. As we get down further to the end of it, do you remember the Hazelwood School? Yeah, it and one house on that block survived. And ultimately, what put the fire out was the fact that the wind died back. It wasn't the blowing, the dynamiting of the buildings. It wasn't the fire. I mean, clearly everything contributed to the fact that the fire stopped where it did, but it had as much to do with the fact that the wind stopped blowing as it did with human efforts against it. To be honest with you, from all that anybody can say about it. Again, in the chaotic moments of running around trying to stop it and being powerless against all these frame buildings. It's nice dry wood, great fuel. So by 4:30, so between 1:30 and roughly between 1:30 starting here and 4:30 ending up there, that took care of the town. That was it.
Just jump over first over to Railroad Street?
It did down here. And what did it jump to? It jumped to Mike Miller's sawmill.
It's what?
Mike Miller's sawmill. Yeah, it jumped that spur line. Well, there used to be a spur line down there, and it jumped it. Yeah. And actually, that was one of the things when I was bugging Fred about where is this thing. I kept looking for the smokestack from the sawmill, and that was one of my locators, because I knew that Miller's had there was a smokestack in the sawmill, and that would help me kind of orient things, because there's no caption saying 3rd and Floral looking west or anything. In some cases there are, like if you go to the Telephone Museum, since everybody was so kind and let me borrow every picture that they had anywhere, including there's a series from Schober, I think Joe Schober's collection of photos that is, and there's one coming up here next, that are labeled where things are, the perspectives are, but otherwise I couldn't tell. So I was looking for a smokestack to identify where things were, if this was Mike Miller's sawmill or not, and what the orientation was based on that. So any errors in the book, if you look at it, all I had to do was go by the documentation on the photo itself and what I know of, the topography and the history of the town. So I take mea culpa for anything, but nobody's pointing anything too huge out to me yet. So, yeah. Okay. So there we go. There's this is one of my favorite walls. That was the one they were really concerned. They pulled that one down as fast as they could. That is probably the Rose Theater, likely. There's the National Bank building. And then that had been, there had been baths there had been a jeweler's there in that space. And as you may recall, that corner of First and Penn, so again, this would be the northeast corner, was not built on until 1982 when they put the bank in that's there now. It stayed vacant for that time. The rest of they were very encouraged, because after the fire, when they started to consider rebuilding, not all companies went back into it, or they wanted to change location or whatever. They didn't have the funds to rebuild and so forth. But other than that space on First, for a block or two, all the burned out lots had been spoken for and had been there. It was a commitment to rebuild, and which is pretty impressive.
The building on the right, that's the auto rest.
That's the auto rest. Yes. That's the auto rest / Kinney building. Yeah. And in fact, if you go into that area and look, there's still some blacking on it that I have been told is from the heat of the fire, it vitrified. And again, this is, I don't know for sure, but that was what I was told. So, yeah.
What's interesting about that picture is the hillside behind it.
Yeah.
How it looks then.
Yeah. Recently logged. Yeah.
That's all.
Grows back.
It does. It's a cool thing about trees. They do that. Yeah. So there's one of the ones that I was able to get from the gracious kindness of the Telephone Museum, where they are, I believe, still displayed. I haven't been there since COVID, since we haven't done anything since COVID for a while here. But that's what yeah. Okay.
How many people were left homeless?
1,800.
Oh, does it say that?
Yeah.
1,800.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And what became of?
That's what, when you go about researching stuff like this, you go, I'm not going to be able to find anything specific about anybody. You can. Go up to the top of the hill. Go to the Trib office. They've got all the hard copies of the newspapers. The reporting was spectacular. And it went on after the fire until, I'd say about the end of 1918, it kind of tapered off, but they gave small little thumbnail descriptions and notes for people, and so you get a bit of an idea. Some people went and stayed with families, family members in Yakima, in Roslyn, wherever. Some people left the area entirely. There had been a dairy before the fire that was there that they picked up and moved to Chehalis, I think. And so much for that dairy, or milk bar. It was actually where you would go to get dairy products in town prior to the fire, and they just up sticks and went. There were people who camped out in tents, but immediately after the fire, a bunch of things happened, including the fact that they got tents from a recent Jehovah's Witness revival. They got tents from the Red Cross. And then tents, the mine owners actually put, invested in some really good tents that they brought electricity to. And those were up at the side of the city park. But there were tent cities, ultimately, both on the east end and on the west end of town that people stayed in. But the miners actually got the ritzy ones with the cool actual floors and stuff and power. And that was what people did. There were stories, but just small little thumbnails of stories about people where there was one woman who was reported on whose husband suffered from asthma. She had 5 children total. 2 were in Europe. And you know what that means, yes? This is World War I. Right. We're fighting in Europe, don't know where exactly, and 3 little ones, and they lost everything, down to the towels and sheets and furniture and everything. And that was where that information came from, was from the reporting in the then Echo, which became the Minor Echo, which became the Tribune. So. Yeah, it's spectacular, and I tried to include as many of those human interest stories as possible in the book, because I had word limits too as to how many words I got for captions, and had to both tell the story factually, but I wanted to have as much of that as I could to illustrate the human side of it, because they were displaced. They were completely displaced, and this was June, and things were not rebuilt by the time the snow flew. It couldn't have been, because they had no sawmill anymore, and they had no cash. People were strapped. People had lost everything, and it was also, again, this is World War I. And I remember my mom talking about this, how patriotic. And I have some surviving letters from my grandfather to my mother, how patriotic the immigrants were, how America was the land of plenty, and this is where they came, and where they chose to. And that manifested itself in the purchasing of Liberty bonds. They tended to do that. They invested in this nation that had welcomed them and didn't have a whole lot of spare cash on hand, and there was no lumber to be bought to begin with at all anyway. So it took its own sweet time to recover, or to do anything resembling recover. And again, also in the paper and also included in the documentation that I've tried to provide is our want ads that when people actually had fire sales, literally. We've got this stuff here. It's on sale. It's for sale. And when they got loads of lumber, they would, the Miller and Short would even say, they put a little blurb in the paper about what had been received on a particular week, what was available. There was an outpouring of sympathy and support from all over the state of Washington as this happened. The night of the fire itself, so June 25th, the night of it, the Adjutant General, I believe, of the state of Washington drove over Snoqualmie Pass. This is in 1918. It was not the road we know today, and made it by the next morning to be able to help out. There was $150 that came from the July 4th dance in Roslyn. It was a fundraiser for the town. There were donations of foodstuffs, of potatoes and flour and blankets, and from wherever it could be it could be as far away again. Chehalis was like really active in this for some reason. Chehalis and Tralee area were really active in being very, very generous to the city of Cle Elum and of course Roslyn, Ronald, etc., as much as they could to help provide for people who had nothing. And again, there's nothing there. So, but it did take time. One of the things that I found interesting in this whole process was that the coal fires, and you can't really see it too well, I think you can see it more clearly in some of the actual photos as presented, because they actually do a pretty good job here with these things. Things smoldered for a really long time. Can you guess why? Bet you can.
Coal. Because of the coal that they burned for their heat.
Yeah.
In their basements.
Exactly. And you could kind of tell who had most. Because the more they had, the longer it smoldered. Yeah, and the longest one was like 2 weeks. 2 weeks it continued to burn. The coal in their coal cellars continued to just smolder for up to 2 weeks, which I think is kind of amazing. Yeah, another thing that cropped up that struck me and is mentioned is the importance of the cook stove. Those in many places, like if you were to walk through here, if we were able to do that, which I'm glad we can't, if we were to walk through there, some of the things that survived where nothing else did were the cook stoves. They were fireproof, or they were pig iron or cast iron, and there are stories of people trying to get them out of the front door of their house because that was their most important thing in their entire household, and of course not being able to. But there are stoves all over the photos that survive from the town after the fire, because it didn't burn and everything else did. So, yeah, let me see what I'm skipping here. Okay, yeah, so after the fire was out at 4:30 in the afternoon on the 25th, the city convened a crisis committee and started making rules and things. They did not want to have the National Guard in to patrol. It was a conscious decision not to have armed people walking the streets of Cle Elum after the fire. They did not want to do that. But the Roslyn Security Force, or whatever the actual name was, they did come and wander around. And the local police force, they were wandering around town. I don't know what they were worried about actually happening, because there was not going to be anything no looting, because there was nothing lootable. Yeah, nothing to steal, but there was security provided. They immediately did what Seattle had done in 1889 when Seattle burned, what Ellensburg did in 1889 when it burned, which was to make a statement or put into law that any rebuilding that took place had to be of fireproof materials. No more of this false front western town look, thank you very much. And that's why Cle Elum and Roslyn look so different from each other. Roslyn they had no fire. And so they have the false fronted timber buildings, whereas Cle Elum, we don't, because they were not going to rebuild and run the risk of the same thing happening again. And that was Mayor Balmer, John Balmer, was the one who convened the committee, and they did get power and phone hooked back up, as I said, at this end, in the west end of town. And they wanted to make sure to enact that particular proviso post haste and get that on the books. Sort of amusingly, the first paper to report on the fire was not the Echo. It was not the Cle Elum Echo. It was the Seattle Times. They're daily, and the Echo was a weekly. And so they hit publication date, and I was able to get the front. It made the front page, and that is the front page of the Seattle Times after the fire. Yeah, so they scooped the Echo, but that's why. And I did manage to get this in here. Playing with old photographs is a challenge. I learned so much by doing that. So as we went along to the end of 1918, things did start to rebuild. And I don't know if you can say things normalized. How can they really normalize? It's kind of like we say, oh, we're going back to normal post-pandemic now. Really? You know, they had a world war going on. And the coverage continued, like I said, in the newspaper for several months afterwards, quite intensively, particularly in what they called the city notes. And that was where you'd find the blurbs. But they also had that thing that then happened, which was a Spanish flu. Mm-hmm. And that and Armistice kind of pushed it out of the papers at that point. It was kind of like, now we're through the acute phase of the fire, the aftermath, and now we need to rebuild. But in the meantime, we've got the Spanish flu around. We've got a world war that is ending, and let's look to the future, was kind of the feeling of the whole thing.
Did you get the feeling that that the people, because the homeless people especially, mm-hmm. that were more affected by this Spanish flu mm-hmm. than if they hadn't been homeless?
Actually, no. Good. Yeah, the things that I read, again, from the Echo, was that the hygiene was really quite good, and that people were very careful in the tent cities, which did still exist, but they were really trying to put stuff up at that point because it was getting cold. And the miners' ones up on the hill, they had very few cases, but there were Cle Elum people who died as a result of the flu. So, yeah, it kind of got pushed out from that. But then you look at this and you go, look at what they did. I mean, my little heart goes pitter-pat. Whoops, as I run into the mic. It does. 1926. Yeah, sorry, Charlene. Yeah, to see, look at that. Okay, we got the State Bank there. But look at that. Cars, I mean, there are pictures of the day of the fire, cars running around trying to help, and also people would load up their cars with whatever they could take and go with them. But just to see that, there's so many cities bigger than Cle Elum that, you know, that's how cities and towns came to an end in other centuries. It was through plague, pandemic, Spanish flu, fires, things like that, earthquakes. Cle Elum didn't give up. And I was just so like, yay! You know, my reaction to sort of tracking this through from beginning to, I can't say end, there is no end, but is to think that this should be an enormous source of pride for this town. And this is when I went about putting this together, it was so that everyone should know that the people of Cle Elum should know or have available this information to be as proud of this town as they should be. And Old Cle Elum, and we all know it's changing, right? But still, this is something this town lived through and came back from, and I was just incredibly proud to be able to record the history and to make it available for everybody so that they could see what this was. And I learned, I mean, so much. Like I said, I went into it knowing nothing. Then I knew the date, and then I saw a picture. And then I came here, and I went up, is it still on the third floor? The Russell Connell picture from Hillcrest that's colorized, yeah, that's a remarkable thing. You need to go up there if you haven't, because there's a whole display there. And it just grabbed my imagination, and of course we'll never know. I listened to some of the oral testimonies from the Kruger collection as well to try to glean information. And my grandmother, who would have had a 2-year-old child and who was living, so my grandparents bought the Reed House, as I said, and some of the photos are from my personal albums that are in here because I had them, yay. Photos. They were not there yet. They were further east, but they were not impacted. Their home was not engulfed, but she never spoke about it. And a lot of people, from what I have gleaned, did not. It was the generation we don't talk about. We just get going. And there was one interview where an elderly woman was being interviewed, and her daughter was there with her, and she spoke mainly Italian, and so the daughter was helping interview. And this is from some of the stuff that Frederick Krueger collected. And asked about the fire. She said 3 words in English: "It was bad." That says it all, I guess. So yeah, and if you've got any further memories or any further information, I dug as much as I could, and again, I had a short time frame, and I've had my because I was also teaching full time as of September. Now, and we were going through a kitchen remodel that year too. Yeah,
Busy year.
it was a busy year, and I was asked, "How did you manage to do this?" And I said, "I didn't sleep much. This is what I did. This is what I did." And sometimes I think, had I had another year or something to poke around and look, would I have found more stuff? Would I have changed how I did it? And nothing has led me to believe that I would. I think I served the topic as well as I could. Yeah.
It's interesting. I was reading another book in 1925. Cle Elum was called Ski Town.
Right.
This was the ski center of Washington State with a jump and everything. So from 1918, over that 5 or 6 years, a lot of vitality.
Exactly.
That's what you're saying, right?
Yes. And in fact, the ski jump is in here.
Oh.
Absolutely. Yeah, because again, it just sort of represents we're not giving up. Yeah. That's not what we do here. And I just thought that was just so wonderful. So
I was wondering, does that say Ellis in the bottom right corner?
The photo.
yes.
He is photographs everywhere. Can you tell me a little bit about him?
I can't. No. The one that I ran into the most, maybe he was the one wandering around with a camera at a gigantic fire. Who does that? I don't know. Oh, that's a terrible thought. Was Russell Connell. Just prolific photographer. But Ellis, there are plenty of Ellises too. But no, I don't have any information on them.
It's on a lot of old postcards and photos that I have.
Interesting.
And I wondered, wow.
Yeah.
Different state.
In different states as well.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, maybe he was an itinerant photographer, literally, yeah. Pretty cool. Yeah. So happy to, my brain works, I'm not a concrete sequential thinker. I'm an abstract random person, and I tend to kind of go boinging around everywhere. But I think I covered most of what I wanted to cover. I'm happy to take questions, comments, or anything else for you now. I do have some books here, which I bought from the publisher, so you can buy them from me underneath the cover price, so for a flat $20. I'm going to be at the farmer's market on Saturday selling books if anybody wants them, and also I'll be doing a walking tour of the fire area and kind of retelling the story that way. When I did this 4 years ago, it depends on how far people actually want to walk and how hot it is, because it's like, I'm done. It's like no more. But we'll kind of cut along sort of the path of the fire. So find me. I don't know exactly where I'm going to be, but I'm going to be in the market somewhere on Friday. And let me know, and we'll leave at 4 from there. So, no, not Friday. Saturday.
After the parade.
After the parade. Yeah. Anything that I missed or that you're curious about that I might know about?
I have a question about the Cava Apartments.
Yes.
Was that the site of Barbara Reed's first running water house?
They were the first to get electricity, I think. I'm not sure about water. Might say in my book, actually. It was 4 years ago. I've forgotten a few details, but yeah, because speaking of pictures that I brought from, yes, first home with running water, and that is my uncle Elio, there, and because they converted it, my grandparents converted it to the apartment house. There's my uncle, and there's my other uncle. So, yeah.
And they converted it when?
They bought it in the 20s and completed the conversion right around the stock market crash because they were really worried about money at that point. Yeah. And then that was my grandmother's baby. She really ran the show there. My grandfather, who he had also run the Gem Cafe for a time after the fire. He'd been a barber before, but he ran the Gem Cafe in direct competition with his own brother who had a restaurant next door down by Pio Coffee, where next door to that, by where the laundromat is today, I think, is where his restaurant was for a brief time. Then he ended up moving to Seattle, and he'd come back here on weekends. So it really was my grandmother who held down the fort on the apartment house. Yeah. Yes?
How did they rebuild? I mean, where did they get the capital to rebuild? Were there, railroads or coal miners or, mines, companies that contributed? Did they have insurance? I mean, how did all this happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for asking that. The loss was in 1918 dollars, between $750,000 and $1 million. Only 20% was insured. So there were contributions. There were some fairly wealthy individuals in town too who contributed from what I could ascertain, and I didn't get a lot of specific information on that. But for example, Joe Schober, who was a grocer, right? He started out Schober's Grocery. He lost everything other than the safe, which was a safe from Casland, and that did survive, but nobody can find it. I tried. But he did have enough money to build the Schober block down on First and what street is that?
It's right there.
P.O.
No, it's west of P.O. Yeah, it's like, that's a Schober block, I think. Yeah.
Schober Grocery was across Hazelwood Grocery. Schober was across from Mike's town.
Okay. Yeah.
Where that gun shop is now.
Yes. Yeah. And so that's about where it jumped. Yeah. Yeah. And so when he rebuilt in brick, but he had the means to do it as a merchant. So I think some of the merchants did have the wherewithal to rebuild their shops. Costello and Duffy's, which went on to be a different Costello and someone else in later years, also rebuilt. So there were funds, there was wealth. However, they managed it at that point, and the bank didn't burn if they had, greenbacks in there. Again, I don't know the details of it, but I think it was through the actual wealth and what had been by the merchants that had been amassed to be able to do so. So, yeah. Probably not a great answer, but I don't have anything better for you.
The quote tiny house the other end of town.
Yeah.
Did they rebuild too?
Some of those were mine financed, I believe. And actually, conditions improved there because they got sewers at that point. They got running water. Their technology improved following the fire. It was at a better level after than it had been before. Yeah. 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 And you can actually see in the plat how they had the funny structure of the blocks, and you can still see it kind of to this day, how the blocks had sort of perpendicularities running through them. But again, I think that was to a fairly great extent financed by the mines. Yeah. Yeah, sorry I don't have more for me on there. Yeah, I dug through the archives and I was going through assessor's reports, tax reports, trying to figure out, trying to connect little breadcrumb trails to get more of an idea of that, but I don't have that context. I wish there were a time machine. When they invent one, I will take a few trips around here and there because I would love to know more myself. Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming on such a beautiful evening. Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah. If you want to take on a walk on Saturday, you know where to find me. And,
Everybody, we have refreshments.
there are
back here.
cookies.
Don't be bashful. Help yourself. And
There are cookies.
say hi to your neighbor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Roberta.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you. And happy 4th of July, everyone. Oh. Would you like it signed, sir? Okay. Oh, really? Okay. Would you like it to be signed to you?
George and Rob.